Because of everything that is going on in the world right now, it seemed to me a good idea to tell some more about the book The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. I already did a video about this book, but that was about the totalitarian system, the totalitarian society. But right now I want to talk about how this is established, what the totalitarian movement exactly is. In this video I want to talk about the people of this totalitarian movement, and in the next two videos I want to talk about propaganda and ideology. And what I also want to do is compare what happened back then in the 20th century with these totalitarian movements to what is happening today. And it's very interesting to see that in a lot of ways they are very similar, but in also a lot of ways they're completely the opposite. So bear with me, it's going to be interesting. So the first group is the bourgeoisie. That was the ruling class, and they had power and status because of education and work and wealth. The second group is the mob, or today we would call them activists or protesters. But of course there is in fact a difference between actual peaceful protesters and the mob. So the mob was the first group that actually fell out of society, fell out of this bourgeois society. Then the third group, the elites, they decided not to be part of this bourgeois society anymore. The elites were the people with power and status, and they had certain kinds of privileges. Then the fourth group are the masses. The masses were the first product of a dying class society. So to give a bit more context to understand the differences between these groups, you have to realize that before this period of time, and we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, before the French Revolution, the societies in Europe were aristocratic societies. So there was a king, then the aristocrats, and they were very wealthy by birth. They had a lot of privileges in the sense that there were actually different laws for them. And then there was the bourgeoisie. Those were the lawyers, the people that were educated, that were not really poor but also not really rich. And then there were the farmers, and they were really poor. So these classes in which you were born into were fixed. You couldn't really climb or descend this ladder of hierarchy in society. You were born into a class, and that was fixed. But then the French Revolution came, and that was the start of the democratic age. So this democratic age bear the idea of equality. So these classes were seen as a very bad thing because we were all equal. So because of the advent of the democratic age, then the bourgeois class became the ruling class. And the aristocrats, well, they were mostly murdered, but became the elites, but they actually really hated the bourgeois class, the people in power. And so the rest of the people were like just one big mass. There weren't classes anymore. It was just one big mass. So then in the beginning of the 20th century, the elites and the mob, they formed an alliance against the bourgeois class, against the ruling class, because they really hated them. And I'm going to elaborate on that later. But they formed an alliance, and then they were really appealing to the masses. And what is interesting about the masses is that they weren't retarded or anything. They were just really isolated. They didn't have connections with family or friends. They were really isolated. And so to give some meaning in their lives, they became part of this movement of the elites and the mob that eventually became the totalitarian movement. And so these masses, they also became very loyal to this movement. And it's because they didn't have anything else to give their loyalty to. They didn't have friends or family. And what is so interesting is that today, I think it's even worse than back then about the isolation of people, because we talk anonymously to strangers on the internet and you can't look people into the eye. You can't see the humanity. It's only words. And that's it. Right now, it's getting even worse with this whole corona story, with the 1.5 meter distance and with the face mask. People are getting more and more isolated, and they're like so lonely in this big mass. And so that's why it's not strange that a lot of people these days are so drawn to activism, so to the mob actually. And the masses, they eventually, they don't really care about themselves. They're not selfish. That's also one thing that's really interesting. They have an ideal and they need to win. They need to win no matter what. And so you could see that in communism, for example, that the ideal was equality. Everybody should be equal. So let's murder the rich people, the people that were actually producing food. And so as a result, there was not enough food anymore. So they don't really care about the long-term consequences or anything. And they don't care about the consequences that would affect their own lives. They only care about winning their goal. What's also interesting is that the ruling class then, the bourgeoisie and the elites and the mob were different things. But right now, it's like, okay, yeah, the mob is one thing, but the ruling class and the elites are today the same thing. They're on the same side, and so back then, they were actually fighting against something, against a powerful institution, let's say. But today, it's like they are the powerful institution, and they're fighting themselves, more or less, and it's weird. So now the question comes to mind, what was it exactly that the elites and the mob hated about the bourgeois class? The bourgeoisie, they had these ideals about humanism, about liberalism, about individualism, and they were pretending to be very good people, but in fact they were just big hypocrites. They didn't live up to their own rules. It was all a big act. And so the elites and the mob, they really resented the bourgeoisie for this, especially the elites. You also have to realize that before World War I, there was this time period of exploring the world, to go to far countries. You could get rid of your place in society that was fixed. You could go to an Indian village or an Arabic society and become one with that other culture, with an exotic culture, and so that was very appealing to a lot of people. Then this time came that was not longer possible, that people were actually stuck. They were stuck in their place in society, and they really hated that. And there was also this very dominant idea of that you are to which group you belong. And it was not about you are what you accomplished. And so it is interesting that back then people hated this idea of you are to which group you belong. But today, this mob and these elites, they are actually promoting this idea that you are the group that you belong to. You're from the gay community, or you're from the black community, and it's every time about thinking in groups. But back then, the mob and the elites, they hated this, and the masses, they really resented this. And so there was no escaping from this. And then World War I started. And before, when you went off to war, then you could do like very heroic things, with your sword and your horse. And that was very adventurous, and it was seen as something noble. But now, World War I, it was the war of the trenches, the war of machine guns. So everyone, every soldier, every captain, every general became this one useless piece of this huge war machine. So it was eventually the big equalizer, World War I. It was the final step in making the classes in society disappear, to make everything and everybody equal. So even suffering was not something individual anymore, because they were all in this war, and they were all equal. And equality, that was also the goal of these people, because they hated the classes. So equality was the goal. Equality was progress. And so it was also seen thus as progress that suffering was not for the individual anymore. Suffering, therefore, was for the group, for the masses. Suffering was equal, so suffering was actually progress for them, which is very crazy. As I explained, the bourgeoisie was very hypocrite. They had these ideals, but they didn't live to them. They did exactly the opposite. It was a very cynical way of living. And so what the mob and the elites and the masses that were drawn to the elites and the mob, what they in fact did was exactly the same as the bourgeoisie did, but then without the hypocrisy. So they were also being cruel. They created this caricature of the bourgeoisie. They did the same, but eventually, because they hated so much this hypocrisy, these ideals of the bourgeoisie, their ideas, their ideologies became the opposite of what the bourgeoisie propagated. So instead of liberalism and humanism, they propagated cruelty and violence. And that became a virtue. So that is very crazy, but yes, cruelty became a virtue because there was no hypocrisy in it. And hypocrisy was the thing that they hated most of all things. To compare it to today, it's also very interesting, because you also have to keep in mind that not all movements are visible to everyone. The movements that are visible in mainstream media is, well, the mainstream media itself, the politicians, and let's say the leftist mob. Leftist by lack of better words, but then you know what I mean. So this is visible, but what about the other side? Maybe now something is going on that is creating on the other side of the left this movement that is going to be like back then in the 20th century. As I said, that these people, the mob and the elites and the masses, they were making a caricature of the bourgeoisie. So they were doing the same thing, but without the hypocrisy. And so what's happening now? People talk about inclusivity, diversity, all these kinds of things. But are they diverse and inclusive themselves? Not about ideas, at least. They are inclusive about skin color, but only judging people for their skin color, only put value to someone because of the skin color, is actually racism. So, because of this, might there be on the other side a group that is like, okay, yeah, we are going to be racist. We're going to do exactly the same thing as you are doing, judging people by the color of their skin, not because of their ideas, not because of what they have accomplished, just as you do it, but then without hypocrisy. We're not going to say that we are inclusive and these kind of things. No, we're just going to say as it is. It's racism. And we're going to do this, like you are doing this. So, I don't know. Maybe this is going on. There are a lot of things going on that people don't know about, but you have to be careful with it. That's why I think this book is very important, because there are a lot of parallels you can see here. So eventually the mob, the elites and the masses were drawn to ideologies that weren't particularly thought through all the way. They weren't particularly meaningful. The only thing that they cared about is that it was the opposite of the ideals of the bourgeoisie. And if you want total loyalty from the masses, then the ideology should be quite empty. And that was also the case during Nazism and communism in the Soviet Union, that people couldn't really know what the ideals were. You could only know what it was if you knew what Hitler or Stalin said the evening before. Because if it was 2 days before, it could be completely different. So you could never really know. And that's the only way how you can create total loyalty. Because people stop thinking for themselves. They just act out what they are being told. And they're fine with it. Because at least it's not the thing that they are opposing. And that's also what you can see today. At least it's not Trump, so it must be good then. Or at least it's not this right-wing idea, so it must be good then. It's like, it doesn't work like that. And so as a result, terrorism became very appealing to this totalitarian movement. It was to express their disappointment in society, to express their hatred. And they were just very nihilistic, and they wanted to create destruction, and that was it. So terrorism was very appealing to them, and that's also something we can see today and in the Black Lives Matter movement, that it's like it's terrorism, and Antifa, it's terrorism. And because of this, it makes sense that for the whole climate change idea, there will also be terrorism eventually. Climate terrorism. It's coming. So the mob and the elites, they were both out of society. They formed an alliance. They took the masses with them, and so they formed a totalitarian movement. But of course, what is a movement without a leader? They needed a leader, and a leader eventually always said what the people were already thinking. Because you can't just tell people new ideas, completely different ideas than they already believed, and expect them to just follow you. It doesn't work like that. People already had these ideas. So in Nazi Germany, people were already hating the Jews to their guts. In the Soviet Union, back then Russia, people already hated everyone that was richer than they were themselves. So then there came these leaders, and they started to organize things. Eventually the masses were used as material to commit the worst atrocities, because everything was in a systematic way. So if everyone does it, and everything is according to the book, according to the rules, then there's no high threshold for people to just commit the atrocities. And that's why the most normal people could commit the worst atrocities there were and actually enjoy it, because it was all organized and it was routine. But then from the point that everything was organized, everything was routine, all the powerful positions in society were taken over by the totalitarian movement. From then on, people couldn't be spontaneous anymore. People couldn't think anymore, because people that think for themselves are actually the enemy of the totalitarian movement. Everybody has to become some kind of robot and just do according to the rules. Just follow the rules, follow the routine, don't think. And so another very interesting aspect from the totalitarian movement, how it was all organized in the beginning by the Nazis, was that they did interviews for the positions in this movement. They would select on pure blood. They would track your family tree and see if you were not Jewish. They would select you on basis of genes and not because of capability. And that's what we actually see today with these diversity quotas and inclusivity quotas. That people are not judged by their capabilities. People are judged by their gender, their sexual preferences, their skin color. And so how is that different from selecting people by being pure of blood, being non-Jewish, and tracking the whole family tree? How is that different? Because in both cases, they're not checking whether people are capable of doing the job. So that's another very interesting parallel. What happens with all these people, with the whole movement, when eventually the totalitarian system collapses? So what happened with all these convinced Nazis at the end of World War II? What happened with all these convinced Bolsheviks after the collapse of the Soviet Union? So during this time period of the totalitarian society, then, like I said, people are like robots. They can't think for themselves. They follow the rules. And because of that, they are most willing to die for their cause. This whole fictional world that the totalitarian propaganda and the totalitarian leaders created, that actually became kind of reality because people believed so much in it. They actually believed that this was reality, so they didn't feel like they were being indoctrinated or anything. This was their reality. And so they were willing to die for this because they didn't think. They were robots. And so then when this system collapsed, then the allies, the English and the American and the Canadian people, they tried to find a convinced Nazi after World War II, but they couldn't find any. But at a certain point, there had to be like 90% of the Germans that had to be a convinced Nazi, but they couldn't find any. And that's because in the end of the whole story of the whole totalitarian system, when it collapses, then people just stop believing it. It vanishes. The thing that the whole ideology, the whole movement that they were prepared to die yesterday, today it's just they stop believing. They become one again in this mass of lost individuals. And so maybe they're waiting for the next ideology to rise, for the next movement. Or maybe they just accept that they lost the bet. It's a very curious situation. So to summarize everything very shortly, what I just told, there were 4 groups in society. The the ruling class, that was the bourgeoisie, the elites that were outside of society, the mob that was outside of society, they formed an alliance together, and the masses, and the three of them, they formed the totalitarian movement. They hated the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie, and so together with their leader and their new ideology that lacked the hypocrisy, it formed the totalitarian movement and went to a totalitarian system. And in the end, when the totalitarian system, as I explained in my other video how that works, as that collapsed, then the whole movement, it vanished. And so that's the whole story. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about propaganda that influences people for the whole totalitarian movement. And video after, I'm going to talk about ideology. So I hope you learned something, and see you at the next one. Bye bye.